Everyone knows that the name of Napoleon Bonaparte is associated with an era of change, grand battles, and the rebuilding of the map of Europe. His meteoric rise from a modest artillery officer to the emperor of the French and conqueror of continental Europe remains one of the most phenomenal in world history. For almost 2 decades, from the end of the 18th century to the fateful year of 1815, the French army under his command seemed invincible, destroying coalitions of European powers, winning battles that are still studied in military academies around the world. The battles of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, Marengo, and many others became symbols of his strategic thinking and tactical mastery. But you may ask me, what exactly was behind this series of triumphs? Why was it Napoleon, and not someone else, who was able to change the course of European and world history with the help of military art? To many, his victories seemed almost mystical, the result of incredible luck or even divine providence. However, behind the apparent magic and personal charisma of the emperor, there was a deep, systematic work that encompassed both revolutionary changes in military doctrine and organizational transformation. The French army, as it became under Napoleon's leadership, was not just a collection of soldiers, but a well-oiled, dynamic mechanism, ideally suited to waging a new type of war. Napoleon did not simply lead this army. He became its brain and heart, infusing it with his ideas, his unyielding will, and his understanding of human psychology. Before the Napoleonic era, warfare in Europe was often characterized by slow maneuvers, cautious strategies, and indecisive battles aimed at exhausting rather than destroying the enemy. Armies were relatively small, made up of professional soldiers and mercenaries, and their supplies were large and tied to fixed bases. The French Revolution and then Napoleon broke these outdated paradigms. They introduced mass conscription, created popular armies whose numbers and motivation were unprecedented, and brought to the art of war dynamism, speed, and the desire for decisive victory, for the complete defeat of enemy forces. Thus, the phenomenon of Napoleon Bonaparte's military victories cannot be reduced to one single factor. It was a complex composition of personal, outstanding military genius, which manifested itself in his strategic thinking, tactical innovation, and ability to inspire his troops. He was strengthened by radical reforms in the organization of the army, which made it more flexible, faster, and more autonomous than the armies of his opponents. And finally, critically important was his innovative and massive use of artillery, which became the main tool for crushing enemy positions. These 3 key elements, interacting with each other, created an alliance that allowed Napoleon to dominate the European battlefields and dictate his will to the continent for many years. We will now look at each of these factors in detail to gain a deeper understanding of the mechanisms that made Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée a symbol of invincible military might. So let's take a closer look at Napoleon's own leadership and tactics. Napoleon Bonaparte won thanks to his genius. It was not just the ability to command troops, but a unique combination of deep strategic thinking, unparalleled tactical intuition, the ability to make decisions in critical situations, and charisma that allowed him not only to lead, but also to inspire masses of soldiers to feats that seemed impossible. He was not just a commander, but a thinker, an innovator, and a war psychologist who turned ideas about the art of war upside down. Famously broke decisively with the outmoded concepts of war prevalent in the 18th century, when armies often avoided decisive battles in favor of maneuvers, sieges, and wars of attrition. He believed in the principle of annihilation strategy, the complete destruction of the enemy's main army in one or more decisive battles. His goal was not simply to occupy territory or inflict losses, but to destroy the enemy's ability to resist by destroying his military force. In fact, Napoleon was obsessed with the idea of speed. He understood perfectly well that the speed of movement and concentration of troops can give a decisive advantage. The French army under his command was trained in rapid marches, and thanks to the corps system, it could move along several parallel routes, significantly ahead of the enemy. It was this speed that allowed Napoleon to take the enemy by surprise, attack him before he had time to fully deploy or take advantageous defensive positions. For example, in 1805, Napoleon very quickly moved troops from the English Channel to the Rhine, and then to Bavaria. In this way, he caught the Austrian army at Ulm by surprise. His troops moved so quickly that they often appeared where they were least expected. This speed helped him control the course of battles, Also worth mentioning is the maneuver on the enemy's lines of communication. This was Napoleon's signature move and one of the most deadly elements of his strategy. Instead of a frontal assault, he sought to outflank the enemy and penetrate deep into his rear, threatening supply lines, depots, headquarters, and escape routes. Such a threat to the enemy's lines of communication created a critical situation. The enemy was forced to either retreat hastily, abandoning supplies and heavy weapons, or fight under unfavorable conditions, with his back to his bases, with disrupted coordination and demoralization. A classic example is the Ulm campaign of 1805. Napoleon then encircled the Austrian army of General Mack with a brilliant maneuver. He completely cut it off from supplies and forced it to surrender almost without a fight. This showed that the threat of encirclement and psychological pressure can be stronger than direct combat. It should also be remembered that Napoleon was a firm believer in the principle of mass, the concentration of superior forces at the main point of a battle or campaign. He was prepared to weaken secondary areas of the front in order to accumulate numerical superiority where, according to his calculations, the outcome of the battle would be decided. This risk was justified by his belief that victory in one place would compensate for any temporary difficulties or even failures in other directions. This concentration of forces was often achieved through the use of the already mentioned rapid marches of corps, which could suddenly converge from different directions. An example of this is the Battle of Austerlitz, where Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank to lure the Allies into a trap, and then struck at their center, concentrating his main forces there. Of course, one of Napoleon's most important qualities as a strategist was his exceptional flexibility. He was never a slave to his initial plans. Unlike many of his opponents who followed rigid instructions, Napoleon constantly analyzed the changing situation on the battlefield and was ready to instantly adapt his strategy and tactics. He knew how to read the battlefield like an open book, anticipate the enemy's moves, and make decisions that were unexpected for him. This required from him and his marshals a high level of situational awareness, quick thinking, and the ability to improvise. His decisions often looked risky, but were based on deep calculation and understanding of the enemy, as well as the ability to quickly assess the situation and make decisions while the enemy was still thinking about his actions. It is worth ignoring the fact that at the tactical level, Napoleon introduced a number of revolutionary changes that formed the basis for military thought for decades to come, and one of these changes was the use of the column and the mixed order. While the armies of the old regime wanted to fight in linear formations, Napoleon actively used columns, deep, narrow formations. These decks had their advantages, and the first important factor was their mobility. They could move quickly across the battlefield and over rough terrain, change the direction of attack faster, and make a breakthrough. The column also acted as a powerful battering ram, capable of breaking through an enemy line in a narrow area. Its dense formation, although vulnerable to artillery fire, exerted enormous moral pressure during a bayonet charge, often causing the enemy to waver before direct contact. And recruits and less experienced soldiers felt more confident in the dense formation of the column, where they were surrounded by comrades, and this reduced the effect of panic and increased resistance to losses. I would also like to tell you that Napoleon often used a mixed order, which combined the advantages of lines and columns. For example, a division could be built in a column for maneuvering, and then deployed in a line for a firefight. Or he could use a combination where two divisions in columns were sometimes covered by a division built in a line. This provided both the force of the blow and fire support. Numerous skirmishers always acted in front, lightly armed infantry operating in loose formation. Their tasks included reconnaissance, harassing fire on the enemy, creating noise and fog to conceal the maneuvers of the main forces and exhausting the enemy's morale even before the main battle, incapacitating the enemy's officers and non-commissioned officers and disrupting his formation. One of Napoleon's distinctive features was his ability to masterfully coordinate the actions of all branches of the armed forces, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. He did not view them as separate, isolated components, but as a single, combined strike force. The artillery prepared the attack, crushing the enemy's defenses with massive fire. Then the infantry went for a breakthrough, taking advantage of the gap created or demoralization. And the cavalry, using its speed and striking power, finished off the disordered enemy, pursued him, and prevented him from regrouping, turning the retreat into a general rout. This coordinated use of all branches of the military made the French attacks powerful and difficult to resist, since the enemy faced successive growing waves of deadly blows. I want to tell you that Napoleon understood that war is not only a battle of armies, but also a battle of wills. He was a master of psychological warfare and one of the greatest motivators in history. Napoleon often appeared at the front lines, in places of greatest danger, demonstrating personal bravery and sharing risks with his soldiers. His presence on the battlefield had a huge impact on the morale of the troops, inspiring them to feats. The soldiers saw that their emperor was not hiding behind their backs, but was next to them, and this strengthened their faith in him and in their own strength. His famous speeches before battles, filled with passion and promises of glory, greatly increased morale. He spoke of patriotism, honor, and the desire for glory, creating a sense of unity and common purpose among the soldiers. Napoleon also created an effective system of rewards that motivated soldiers and officers regardless of their background. The Legion of Honor, which he introduced, became an award for military and civilian merit, available to anyone who showed bravery. Unlike the aristocratic armies of the old regime, where promotion often depended on nobility and wealth, in Napoleon's army, the path to the highest ranks was open to all who were talented and brave. Many of his marshals had started out as ordinary soldiers or junior officers. For example, Ney was the son of a cooper, Murat of an innkeeper, and Lannes of a groom. This merit-based system created intense competition and encouraged initiative. It ensured that the most capable men occupied key positions, which in turn ensured high-quality command at all levels. Napoleon also had a rather favorite phrase that said that morale was 3 times more important than physical strength. It perfectly reflects his philosophy. For example, Ney was the son of a cooper, Murat was an innkeeper, and Lannes was a groom. This merit-based system created strong competition and encouraged initiative. It ensured that the most capable people occupied key positions, which in turn ensured high-quality command at all levels. Understanding the psychology of the enemy was also very important. And so Napoleon was not only a master of influencing his troops, but also the enemy. He knew how to use tactical tricks, deceptions, and psychological pressure to break the enemy's will to resist before the decisive battle. His surprise attacks, rapid encirclements, flanking attacks, and powerful artillery bombardments were not only needed to inflict damage, they also paralyzed the enemy with fear, confusion, and a sense of hopelessness, which often led to panic and flight. And in the end, all these traits of Napoleon's brilliant leadership, his strategic mind, his new tactics, his quick adaptation, and his ability to inspire people became the basis for his incredible military victories. He didn't just lead, he embodied victory itself, and we smoothly move on to the second reason, which was, of course, a good army. It is quite obvious that even the most brilliant commander cannot achieve victories without an army capable of implementing his plans. Napoleon Bonaparte was very lucky, or more precisely, he himself created a powerful, flexible, and effective Grand Army. Its structure and principles of recruiting soldiers did not simply improve the old methods, but completely changed them. They differed from the armies of the 18th century and laid the foundations of modern troops. And the main innovation that Napoleon not only took, but also ideally improved, was the system of army corps. Although it existed before him, it was Napoleon who made it the basis of his strategy. This gave his army incredible flexibility and speed. Each corps was like an independent mini-army. It could act on its own and had everything necessary for battle and life. 2 or 3 infantry divisions, 1 or several cavalry brigades, a lot of artillery, engineers, doctors, and its own headquarters. Such independence allowed the corps to hold the line for several days against a strong enemy until help arrived, or until Napoleon gathered all the troops for a decisive blow. Individual corps could carry out their tasks, and the commander-in-chief did not need to control each small detachment. In fact, before the corps system, huge armies moved in one continuous, slow column along one road, which led to monstrous congestion and made their movement slow. Dividing the army into several autonomous corps allowed them to move along several parallel roads. This not only eliminated congestion, but also significantly increased the overall speed of movement of the entire army. The Grande Armée could cover distances of 25 kilometers per day, which was much faster than any other army of the time, which was only able to cover 15 kilometers. This speed allowed Napoleon to create the effect of surprise on the enemy and carry out his famous flanking movements, appearing where he was not expected. The movement along different roads simplified the supply of the army. Each corps could take food and forage from the locals and use field depots. This greatly reduced the dependence on slow and vulnerable supply trains, which had been a major problem for armies before. This system gave the army more freedom of movement and allowed it to operate far from supply bases. Although this was not liked by the locals, for the French army it was an important advantage in speed and maneuverability. Despite the separate movement, the corps were always close to each other, a day's march or less. This allowed Napoleon, as soon as he found the enemy's main forces, to quickly gather his entire army for the main attack. This gave him a huge advantage. He could concentrate overwhelming forces at the right moment, which was impossible for other armies. The principle was simple: to separate for the march and concentrate for the battle. This helped him to act suddenly and always have more forces where the outcome of the battle was decided. Napoleon carefully selected corps commanders, many of whom were his talented marshals. Davout, Lannes, Soult, Ney were examples of such. He gave them freedom to make decisions on the ground, trusting their experience. At the same time, Napoleon himself controlled the overall campaign plan, constantly received reports, analyzed the situation, and gave new orders. Such a system allowed for the effective use of initiative on the ground, avoiding delays due to coordination with the general staff. Thus, the army worked as a single but dynamic organism. It is also worth mentioning that the French Revolution greatly changed the composition of armies by introducing compulsory military service. Napoleon not only retained this principle, but also improved the conscription system, making it an extremely effective tool for maintaining the enormous size of his army. The ability to conscript hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens into the army gave France a huge advantage in many wars. It helped Napoleon to replace the large losses in his aggressive campaigns and to consistently keep his army larger than his opponents. While other countries had relatively small, expensive professional armies, France could raise larger troops. Although conscription could be unpopular and cause resentment, many soldiers, especially at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, were strongly motivated by the ideals of the French Revolution, namely liberty, equality, fraternity. They fought not for a king, but for France, for their people, and later for their emperor. This foundation gave them high morale, fortitude in battle, and a willingness to sacrifice themselves. This was not the case with the mercenary armies of the old regime, which fought mainly for money or under duress. There was also a special concept of the citizen who defended his homeland, and it led to the creation of a more motivated and dedicated army compared to armies composed of professional soldiers or mercenaries for whom war was a job. This gave the French army a national identity, while other armies were often a mix of different nationalities and interests. And despite the mass conscription, Napoleon paid great attention to the quality of his troops, their training and discipline. He had an officer corps. The corps of the Grande Armée was made up of veterans of the French Revolutionary Wars. These experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, who were already accustomed to being in battle, were invaluable teachers for new recruits. They passed on their combat experience, taught discipline and tactics, creating professional units. Many of them were ordinary people who had proven their skills right on the battlefield. As in any army, there was strict discipline and constant military training. Napoleon restored and maintained the strict discipline that had been weakened in the chaotic early years of the Revolution. Regular drills, fire training, and tactical maneuvers allowed his troops to act in a coordinated manner, quickly change formations, and effectively apply tactical techniques on the battlefield. There was discipline, but at the same time, officers and soldiers were capable of initiative, which was a key difference from the mechanical discipline of many other European armies. And one of the revolutionary and motivating aspects of Napoleon's army was the principle of meritocracy. That is, promotion was based on ability, courage, and intelligence, not on nobility or wealth. Unlike the aristocratic armies of the old regime, where officer positions were often bought or inherited, in Napoleon's army any ordinary soldier could rise to the rank of Marshal of France. Men like Ney, the son of a cooper, Murat, the son of an innkeeper, and Lannes, the son of a groom, became top military leaders simply because of their talent and bravery in battle. This system strongly motivated every soldier and officer to show his best side. It generated enormous loyalty to the emperor and to France, and it also ensured high-quality command at all levels. This meant that the best and most capable men occupied the most important positions, but Napoleon skillfully used the desire for glory and personal rewards. The creation of the Legion of Honor became a motivational tool, allowing for military and civil merits to be rewarded regardless of origin. These awards, as well as the personal attention of the emperor, created an atmosphere in which each soldier strove to distinguish himself and bring glory to himself and his unit. He understood that honor was the engine for the military, and as a result of these reforms and organizational principles, the Grande Armée became not only the most numerous, but also the most flexible, fast, disciplined, and motivated army of its time. It was able to carry out complex decrees, withstand heavy losses, and quickly restore combat effectiveness, and this made it invincible for many years. And we finally come to the very last factor, which was the use of artillery and Napoleon's main force. Everyone knows that he was not only a commander, but also a graduate of the artillery school, and this gave him a unique and deep understanding of the potential of this type of troops. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who considered artillery simply a means of assistance, Napoleon turned it into a decisive factor on the battlefield. It became an instrument that literally opened the way to victory. His new approach to artillery was one of the main reasons for his military successes, but by the time Napoleon came to power, French artillery was already one of the most advanced in Europe, thanks to reforms that had been done before him, including the Gribeauval system. This system, created at the end of the 18th century, completely changed the production and use of artillery. It is known that before Gribeauval, each weapon was unique, and this made repairs difficult and time-consuming. The Gribeauval system made all the parts of the cannons, their carriages and shells, identical and interchangeable. This meant that a broken cannon could be quickly repaired right on the battlefield, using parts from other cannons. This standardization greatly simplified the delivery, production, and maintenance of artillery. It also allowed for the rapid training of artillerymen, since they worked with the same equipment. For example, mobility was greatly increased. Gribeauval's guns were lighter and more maneuverable than those of other armies. Improved carriages, a more thoughtful design, and lightweight barrels allowed the guns to be moved more quickly across the battlefield. They could be transferred to important areas and even used in difficult-to-reach places. Thanks to special wheels and lightweight construction, French guns kept up with the rapid marches of infantry and cavalry. Technological improvements such as better sights, the use of more sophisticated gunpowder, and more efficient charges increased the accuracy and rate of fire of French guns. This allowed them to deliver more destructive blows to enemy positions in a shorter time. Artillerymen were well trained and could quickly reload and aim their guns, maintaining a high intensity of fire. Napoleon was certainly well aware of these advantages and made the most of them. He not only adopted the existing system, but also brought its application to a level never seen before. There was also a special principle called the Grand Battery. This was Napoleon's most characteristic and destructive tactic in the use of artillery. Instead of placing guns along the entire front, as his opponents often did, Napoleon collected a huge number of guns in one place, creating the so-called Grand Battery. This tactic had its advantages. For example, with its help, there was massive firepower. The main goal of the big battery was to create overwhelming firepower on a narrow section of the front. Hundreds of guns, collected in a small area, could bring down a barrage of cannonballs, grenades, and then grape shot on the enemy. This so-called artillery storm was capable of penetrating even strong defenses, breaking battle formations, destroying fortifications, and causing huge losses. No army of that time could withstand such intense fire for long. Under such fire, even the most steadfast began to doubt, lose formation, get confused, and eventually retreat or even panic. This made them an easy target for infantry and cavalry attacks. Many enemy soldiers called such fire an unbearable hell. You might think that the large battery had no special preparation for attack. However, this was not the case. In fact, it was rarely used as an end in itself. Its main task was to prepare the ground for a decisive attack by infantry or cavalry. After several hours of heavy bombardment, when the enemy was disorganized and demoralized, Napoleon sent in fresh troops. They went to break through the defense, often using columns for a quick bayonet charge. The artillery continued to support the attackers, transferring fire to new targets or shelling the enemy reserves. Examples of this use of the Grand Battery were the battles of Friedland in 1807, where a powerful artillery strike on the Russian center decided the outcome of the battle, and especially at Wagram in 1809, where Napoleon assembled over 400 guns into a single battery to break the Austrian lines and open the way for a breakthrough. These were some of the most significant uses of such tactics, and they were truly effective. However, Napoleon didn't just use these weapons. As you might think, he also knew how to move them quickly, making artillery a tactically flexible tool. They had horse artillery in their ranks, and this was one of the key innovations that gave artillery unprecedented mobility. Unlike regular artillery, where soldiers walked, in horse artillery, the entire crew was mounted. This allowed them to move as quickly as cavalry, or to quickly change positions on the battlefield, supporting attacks or repelling counterattacks. Horse artillery could quickly move to the enemy's flanks, occupy advantageous heights, or appear where fire was most needed. Its ability to quickly deploy wherever support was needed gave Napoleon a tactical advantage. This allowed him to reinforce strike groups at the most critical moment. In action, Napoleon himself was not afraid to move artillery to close range of the enemy, often at point-blank range. This is where grapeshot came into play, a charge consisting of many metal balls that when fired fanned out, acting like a giant shotgun. Grapeshot was a deadly weapon against dense groups of infantry and cavalry at close range up to 300 to 400 meters. It could destroy entire ranks of soldiers. Napoleon used it to stop enemy attacks, finish off already weakened units, or clear the way for his assault groups. Grapeshot fire at close range was so dense that it was almost impossible to survive under it. Napoleon's artillery always worked in conjunction with the infantry and cavalry. It did not simply fire at the enemy, but literally cleared the way for the advancing troops. It suppressed enemy fire, created chaos, and reduced morale before the main forces went on the attack. This approach made French attacks very effective and difficult to repel, since the enemy first received a powerful artillery strike and then faced fresh, motivated troops. And being an artillery officer by training, Napoleon certainly had a deep knowledge of ballistics, artillery tactics, and logistics. He personally supervised the placement of artillery on the battlefield, chose the most advantageous positions, and determined the targets for the next fire. He, like no one else, understood how to make the most of the destructive power of artillery. Napoleon knew that artillery is not only a weapon, but also a powerful psychological tool. It could break the enemy's will to resist even before hand-to-hand combat, giving moral and physical superiority. Thus, all these factors, improved artillery, massed fire tactics, high mobility, and Napoleon's personal skill, made the French artillery the most deadly branch of the military during the Napoleonic era. This gave it a major advantage in most battles. But this is not the end of our story. I propose to consider several additional factors and various conditions of Napoleon's victories. In addition to Napoleon's personal talent, the effective organization of his army, and the new use of artillery, there were other important factors that helped him win. These elements, although not always the main ones, played a large role in creating the conditions for his plans and helping the Grande Armée to outperform its enemies. In the military sphere, it has often been said that an army marches on its stomach. Supplying troops has always been a very difficult task for commanders, especially for those who led huge armies during Napoleon's time. Despite the difficulties, Napoleon greatly improved the existing supply system, making his army less dependent on slow and vulnerable supply trains. As mentioned earlier, the system of corps, which moved along different roads, allowed the army to make extensive use of local resources. Each corps, passing along its strip, could send men to neighboring villages and farms to collect food and fodder for the horses. This helped reduce the dependence on long, vulnerable, and slow supply lines that could be easily cut by the enemy. This system allowed the French armies to operate faster and deeper into enemy territory without being tied to permanent bases. However, it must be remembered that this method also had its drawbacks. For example, it could cause discontent among the local population, which led to guerrilla warfare, and was ineffective in sparsely populated or already war-ravaged regions. While the principle of living off the land was important, Napoleon did not rely solely on it. To supply his troops with ammunition, heavy equipment, medicine, and food when local resources were scarce, he used a vast network of field depots. They were built along the army's routes and in captured towns. These depots were replenished by large supply trains that brought supplies from France or from captured territories. Improving the army's supply trains and creating more efficient transport units, such as baggage battalions, also helped move supplies more quickly and in an organized manner. Napoleon sought to create an efficient, if not perfect, system. It supported his rapid maneuvers and allowed his army to operate far away. Of course, coloring and communication were also important factors in waging war, since being aware of the position of both one's own and enemy troops was critical to making the right decisions. Napoleon paid great attention to this aspect, understanding that information was the key to success. He even created a highly organized and competent headquarters, headed by his indispensable chief of staff, Louis-Alexandre Berthier. Berthier was an excellent expert in logistics, organization, and the transmission of orders. The headquarters collected information from intelligence, marshals, and defectors. Then they analyzed it, planned, and coordinated actions. Despite the fact that Napoleon's marshals, although they had freedom in managing corps, were also an important source of information, they constantly reported on the situation in their areas, enemy movements, and the state of their troops. Let's not forget about the developed and reliable communication system using fast couriers, because it was this that allowed orders to be transmitted in a timely manner and information to be received from the battlefield. This gave Napoleon the opportunity to react to changes in the situation and adjust plans in real time, which was impossible for less organized armies, whose generals often acted in an information vacuum. Napoleon could dictate orders at night, and they would be delivered over significant distances by morning. I think it is a well-known fact that Napoleon himself was an active scout and a master of maps. He often personally reconnoitered the terrain before battles, carefully studying the landscape, relief features, the location of roads, rivers, and villages. This gave him an understanding of the battlefield and allowed him to use the terrain to his advantage, for example, to hide maneuvers, set up ambushes, or choose advantageous positions for artillery. His ability to read the terrain was legendary, and he often saw tactical opportunities where others did not. But even with all of Napoleon's brilliant moves, one cannot ignore the fact that his opponents often suffered from their own systemic problems and made critical mistakes that Napoleon skillfully exploited. For example, many European armies adhered to the outdated doctrines and organizations that they inherited from the 18th century, which were outdated. These armies were inflexible, maneuvered more slowly, their artillery was practically immobile, and the rules of command were complex and bureaucratic. Officers were often aristocrats by birth, not by skill. This led to a lack of competence in important positions and a decrease in initiative. I would also like to mention that Napoleon was opposed throughout his career by coalitions of European countries. These coalitions, despite their power, often suffered from internal discord, mistrust between allies, conflicting interests, and, most importantly, the lack of a single and effective command. Different armies spoke different languages, had different laws, and their generals often could not agree on a single strategy or on who would make the decisive decisions. This allowed Napoleon to apply the principle of divide and rule, breaking up his opponents piecemeal. The Allies were often unable to react quickly to his bold and unexpected maneuvers. Although there were talented generals among the Allied armies, on the whole the level of command of Napoleon's opponents was often inferior to him and his marshals. They were less decisive, slower to react to changing circumstances, and often acted according to old patterns that Napoleon easily predicted and exploited. Their indecisiveness and tendency toward conservative solutions were quite different from Napoleon's aggressiveness and innovation. Also often acted too slowly and indecisively. This gave him time to prepare, make a maneuver, or gather forces. They were too cautious and afraid to take risks. Napoleon, on the other hand, was not afraid of bold and sometimes risky steps that brought him a decisive advantage. This slowness allowed him to seize the initiative and dictate his terms on the battlefield. All these factors, although they were not the main reasons for Napoleon's victories, but they created the necessary environment in which Napoleon could show his best, and his army could act with great efficiency. They emphasized that a military victory is always the result of a complex interaction of many factors, and not just the actions of one person. That was all the factors for today. Let's summarize the information we heard. I want to say that Napoleon Bonaparte's military career was not just a series of individual victories, but a real phenomenon that forever changed the face of European warfare and the political landscape. As we have examined in detail, his unprecedented triumphs were not the result of chance or pure luck. They arose from a complex set of factors that reinforced each other. This created a powerful effect against which the old armies were powerless. His strategic foresight, which was expressed in the desire to completely destroy the enemy, his striking maneuvers on enemy obstacles, the ability to incredibly quickly concentrate forces, and exceptional flexibility in adapting to a frequently changing situation, were undeniable. This man was not just an excellent tactician, but also a professional psychologist. It was he who seemed to be able to read the enemy's thoughts and, most importantly, inspire his soldiers to incredible feats, using his wonderful personal charisma, a system where they advanced on merit and the cult of glory. One of his most famous phrases was that, "Morality is much more important than physical strength 3 times." And it was precisely this that could clearly show how deeply he understood the role of man and, most importantly, military leadership in military affairs. Also, the second, but no less important reason, was his revolutionary army efficiency. This amazing core system, which was developed and brought to perfection by Napoleon, was able to transform the French army into a mobile, flexible, and self-sufficient fighting force with which Napoleon could achieve his brilliant victories. And the ability to move along several parallel routes dramatically increased the speed of marches and allowed him to achieve surprise, concentrating superior forces at the point of the decisive blow. And the mass conscription provided an admirable and large number of troops, and the principles of promotion by merit and strict discipline, which were maintained by experienced officers, were able to guarantee the high quality and motivation of these popular armies. Finally, his innovative and massive use of artillery played a very important role. Thanks to his personal artillery education, Napoleon understood the firepower of weapons like no other. He made the most of the advantages of the French Gribeauval artillery system, but it was his grand battery tactics that were truly revolutionary. It was there that the massive concentration of hundreds of guns on a narrow section of the front allowed him to remove the enemy's defenses, inflict great losses, and suppress morale, paving the way for further attacks by infantry and cavalry. It was this high mobility of horse artillery and the deadly use of grapeshot at close range that complemented this destructive arsenal and helped him achieve brilliant victories on the battlefield. Of course, one cannot ignore the favorable circumstances, which included the outdated military doctrines of his opponents, their disunity within coalitions, and frequent command errors. These factors created a small vacuum, and it was this that helped Napoleon masterfully manage his army. One cannot ignore the fact that the legacy of Napoleon's victories is enormous. He was not only able to rebuild the map of Europe, but also change the art of war forever. His principles of strategy and tactics, speed, surprise, concentration, maneuver on communications, combined attack of the branches of the armed forces, became the basis for future military knowledge and, of course, were studied in academies in our time. It was he who proved that a well-organized, motivated, and competently managed army, even consisting of ordinary citizen conscripts, could surpass the old professional armies. But eventually his fine string of victories was broken. Therefore, Napoleon Bonaparte will forever remain in history as one of the great generals whose victories became an example of military skill,